This is unit 5.4, the standard form of the equation of a line. So far we've been looking at lines that are in this form, y equals mx plus b. So where m is the slope and b is the y-intercept. Not all lines come looking like this. Sometimes they look like ax plus by plus c equals 0. So remember way back when we were doing those questions about, dimes and nickels, or we were making some kind of trail mix with nuts and raisins, or there was one about hockey skates and figure skates. And so we were making equations in two variables, but they didn't look like y equals mx plus b. So they might have looked something like they might have looked something like 2 f plus 3 h equals 27, or something like that. So this is what we call standard form. So sometimes the constant, like that 27 right there, sometimes that's on the right hand side of the equation and sometimes it's on the left hand side of the equation, but either way it's standard form. This is also sometimes known as implicit form. That's an M right there, not an N. So implicit form, because nothing is really stated. It's kind of implied. We can't explicitly figure out what the slope is or what the starting value is. There is just some kind of implied relationship between the two variables. So again, sometimes that 27 is written on the right, and sometimes the same equation would be written. You'd bring the 27 over to the other side. That would make it minus 27, and then 0 would be on the right-hand side. Either one of those can be considered the standard form of the line. There's a couple of things that we try to make sure happens. I just want to erase some of this. There's a couple of things that we try to make sure happens. And firstly, it's called the leading coefficient. So that number, the a value, the very first number you see in the equation, we try to make sure that that is a non-negative number. So it's positive. Well, non-negative means it could be 0, but if it's 0, then the a isn't even there. But it has to be a whole number, so it has to be a non-negative number. And then b and c must be integers. So they can't be decimals, they can't be fractions, they have to be integer values. So the first thing we're going to look at is how do we rearrange the equation? And we've done this rearranging thing before. How do we rearrange them so that we can get them into y equals mx plus b form? Because right now, if we take a look at question A here, you might want to say that the y-intercept is 10, but it actually isn't. In order to be able to state the y-intercept, it must be in this form where the y is isolated. So the y has to be by itself. You can't have the y and the x all on the same side of the equation. You can't have a number in front of the y. Everything has to be, the y has to be by itself on one side of the equation. So that could be either y equals mx plus b. It could also be mx plus b equals y, whichever way you want to do it. But m and b, they can be any value, like they can be fractions. They don't have to be whole number values. They can be whatever they actually are. So if you recall, we did this before. So what I'm going to do here is because I want the y by itself, I'm actually going to move the y over to the other side. Sometimes you'll move the y to the other side. Sometimes you'll move the other terms to the other side. My strategy here is to make it so that the coefficient on the y is positive. And if I move, right now, it's a minus 3. And if I move it over to the other side, it will now be a positive 3. And then I've got 4x plus 10 left on this side. And then finally, the last thing is divide both sides by 3. And so then you get y equals 4/3 x. So this is 4 over 3. And then it's also 10 over 3. So plus 10 over 3. So now we know that the slope equals 4/3 because the slope is the coefficient on the x. And that the y-intercept in this case equals 10/3. All right, on part B, I would leave the 18y on the left-hand side of the equal sign because it's already positive. So I'm just going to leave the 18y there, and I'm going to move the 12x and the minus 8 over to the other side. So that's going to be a minus 12x and plus 8. Now when I divide both sides by 18, that gives me minus 12 over 18x plus 8 over 18. But those fractions are not in reduced form. So we have to, or lowest terms, we have to reduce all fractions. And like I said before, in this unit, you cannot convert things to decimals. I want all fractions. So 12 and 18 are both divisible by 6, so that's going to be negative 2 over 3x. And then 8 and 18 are both divisible by 2, so that'll be 4 over 9. So therefore, the slope of this straight line is negative 2/3, and the y-intercept for this straight line is 4/9. Okay? So that's how you go. Basically, there's two, other than the reducing part, there's basically 2 steps. Step number 1 is move something. Move. Either move the y term or move the other 2 terms, but you've got to move something to the other side. And then step 2 is divide by the coefficient. So that's it. 2 steps, move and then divide. Okay? All right, for example 2, we're going the other way. We want to express each line in standard form. So we want to change the form that they're in to standard form, which means I need to get rid of any fractions, because if you remember, it says right here, a is a whole number, so the coefficient on the x has to be positive, and then b and c also have to be integers. So what we're going to do is we're going to do exactly the opposite as what we did in the previous question. So in the previous question, we did move and then divide. Well, the opposite operations in the reverse order. So instead of dividing, we're going to multiply. So I'm going to take this whole equation and I'm going to multiply by the lowest common denominator. So I'm going to multiply that by 4. That's going to get me 4y equals, this 4 will cancel out with that one, but I'm not going to cross it out because it's only canceling while I multiply this term by 4. So that's a minus 5x. And then the minus 3 also has to be multiplied by 4, so that's a minus 12. So step number 1 is multiply. And then step number 2 is move. And you want to move so that the coefficient on the x is positive. Right now, the coefficient on the x is negative. So how do I make that positive? I have to move it to the other side. So that means everything that's on the same side of the x is going to get moved over. So the 5x is going to get moved over, and the 12 is going to get moved over as well. And if I write this in the order of ax plus by plus c, the x term comes first, so that's going to be a 5x. Then the y term. The y term didn't change sides, so it doesn't change signs. And then the 12 is coming over to be on that side as well, so that's plus 12, and that equals 0, and you're done. Okay, with the next one, what do we have to multiply by? We have to multiply by the lowest common denominator. I have a denominator of 8 and I have a denominator of 4, and the lowest common denominator is 8. If that was like a 3 and a 4, then you'd have to multiply by 12. So it's the lowest common denominator. That's what you need to multiply by. So every term here, let me just do this. This term has to be multiplied by 8. This term needs to be multiplied by 8. And this term needs to be multiplied by 8. So y times 8, that gives us 8y. And then negative 3/8 x times 8. The 8 will cancel, and that gives you a negative 3x. And then 7/4 times 8, the 4 and the 8 will cancel, and I'm just going to show that here because it's the last multiplying that I have to do. The 4 and the 8 cancel, that gives you a 2 there, and so then that is plus 14. Okay, now which side am I going to move everything to? Am I going to move it to the left side, or am I going to move it to the right side? Think about that for a second. Okay, so it's all going to go to the left side again because right now the coefficient on the x is negative. If I was to move the 8y over to the right, that means that the coefficient on the x is still negative, and I want the coefficient on the x. The a is a whole number, and a whole number is a positive number. So I'm going to move the 3x and the 14 over to the other side. So 3x is going to be positive. The 8y is still positive. And when the 14 comes over, it becomes a minus, and you're done. Okay, so that's how you change from one form to another, from standard form to y equals mx plus b form, or from y equals mx plus b form or slope y-intercept form to standard form. I'm going to stop this video there, and I will do another video after this.